150 years ago, the Red River War altered the course of lives forever. Not only those who perished and those who survived, but every life since, even yours and mine. I am Andy Furnick, a filmmaker and local of the West Texas Panhandle, and I am with J. Brett Cruz to explore Undertold stories of the Red River War. Born in the West Texas Panhandle, J. Brett Cruz is a legend of Red River War archaeology. He was awarded Master of Arts in Anthropology from Texas A&M University. Maestro Cruz is the Director and Chief Archaeologist of Historic Sites Operations for the Texas Historical Commission, sponsor of the Red River War Battle Sites Project and investigation directed by Maestro Cruz beginning in 1998. He is the award-winning author of Battles of the Red River War, Archaeological Perspectives on the Indian Campaign of 1874. Maestro Cruz is most gracious and has consented to our live recording of his presentation today at Charles and Marianne Goodnight Ranch State Historic Site. We continue our discussion with J. Brett Cruz in the following question and answer segment. Now, because the audience participants are not recorded with microphone and have signed no consent release for their recording, I have transcribed and recorded voiceovers of their questions verbatim from the live Q&A. The following are the attendant participants' questions as they pose them to Maestro Cruz. A gentleman asks, Brett, do you ever see the day coming when the Palo Duro Canyon State Park, that'll open up the south end of the park, where the battle was, and people can get in there and see it?
Well, I can't speak for Palo Duro Canyon or Texas Parks and Wildlife, but when we did our investigations there back, we visited that battle site in 2003, and at that time, just a very small portion of the battle site was on property that was owned by Texas Parks and Wildlife. And it didn't include any of the battle site proper. It included areas that we were able to document where the Indians were retreating away from the battle and making their escape up the canyon. Texas Parks and Wildlife has now purchased the rest of that battle site. It is remote. If you're familiar with Palo Duro Canyon State Park, where the highway makes the loop, you can drive all the way down and then it loops around and starts coming back. There's a historical marker right there that talks about the battle. From that point on down, the battle site proper is probably about another 5 miles, and there's no way to get to it except just hike through some very rough, thick, overgrown country. It's my understanding that Parks and Wildlife is, for the moment, preserving all of that area that they purchased because they won't have time to do their own inventory of what's there. They want to, of course, establish fences on what's now their property and stuff. And all that's just going to take a lot of time. And then, of course, if they ever decided to do some archaeological investigations down there, that takes resources and money and the whole thing to do. Our personal hope is that eventually they will, but we'll just have to wait and see.
A madame comments, I just want to say that I run a nonprofit called Open Palo Duro, and what we're trying to help with is set up a limited, permitted system permitting people out there, volunteers who will help with that. We've been working with the park for about 2 years. So, if you want to go to openpaloduro.com, our idea is that there are already people trespassing out there anyway. And to try and sort of mitigate that, we'd like to have, we want to have a permitted system in place. And eventually, in the next 10 years, so that we will know who is out there, where they're going, what they plan on doing. The park has looked at, trekking system, building trails out there, and so we're just a partnership that does that. So, if you want to check out Open Palo Duro, we're certainly not into opening that area to everybody. We think that a limited permit system is the safest way to do it. So, if you want to check us out, there's a lot of information on our webpage.
And there's just no access right now. There's just really no way to get people down there unless they hike in and stuff,
A gentleman asks, what was the range of those howitzers?
The range of the howitzers themselves, depending on their elevation, what elevation you set them up. It's my understanding that those small mountain howitzers there, about 350, I don't know, someone here can probably answer that question better than I can, but it's not a great range. Maybe 500 if the elevation is set just right on those. Yeah.
A gentleman asks, how do you get the Army reports?
We got the Army reports we hired a historian to go to the National Archives and did extensive research there and was able to find somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,200 or so additional pages related to the Red River War that had not been previously documented as part of this campaign. They were misfiled, misplaced in certain areas, but that's how we got most of the Army reports. Now, some of those Army reports, of course, have been previously published. The Panhandle Plains Museum did, I think, the Panhandle Plains Historical Society published a number of years ago reports related to Mackenzie and his part of it, but we found an extensive number of others that were not part of that.
A gentleman asks, something I've been trying to get my mind around is the metal artifacts. It seems like a lot of arrowheads, a lot of arrows, a lot of munitions that people have to be carrying for battles that last, several days, that kind of thing. How do you explain that amount of material that people are carrying out in the middle of nowhere, right? It amazes me that volume of them that are out there, hundreds of miles from anywhere, right?
So your question is the relatively large amount of metal artifacts, what appears to be a relatively large amount of metal artifacts that we found or that were out there. So keep in mind, by 1874, that's relatively late. So there was a lot of metal that was being used. The Native Americans by 1874 were not using flint and chert and stuff hardly at all. They were relying on and using metal for tools, for pots, for weapons, and they were getting that from any source that they could. A lot of it was coming from Comanchero trade. A lot of it was coming from the Army itself. The Army had issued rifles to the warriors to hunt with, the ones that had been on the reservation and stuff. But the other types of metal, raiding, getting it wherever they could, wagon wheel bands, whatever piece of metal they could find from any source, they were getting and using. And even though it seems like a lot that we found, it's a tiny fraction of what was actually being used and utilized. They were raiding everywhere. They were going as far as into Mexico, raids and stuff. The Comanchero trade that was coming out of New Mexico, bringing specifically those types of items out here in trade for livestock and in some cases, prisoners.
A madame asks, so with this imbalance of weapons on the other side, and going back to your opening of the premise, you said about this war of racism, and then you said the objective must be eradication. Why didn't it happen? It easily could have happened, yet there were really relatively few deaths.
There were relatively few deaths during the Red River War, that's true, and in the battles. And one of the reasons that there were relatively few deaths during the battles is the discrepancy between the range of weapons that the U.S. Army had versus the range of weapons that the Native Americans were using. For example, the Native Americans were using the .44 Henry, the Spencer, those types of rifles. They were repeater rifles. They could hold up to 15 rounds. You would think initially they would have the advantage in those types of weapons. The .45 caliber weapon that the soldiers, the .45 Springfield, it was a single shot. You fired one time, then you had to reload. But its range was up to 1,000 yards, whereas the weapons, the firearms that the Indians were using, the .44 and the Spencers, short range, 250, 300 yards. So the Indians were familiar enough to know they had to stay out of range of the weapons that the soldiers were using. And they were not trying to attack the soldiers during these battles. They were trying to evade the soldiers and lead the soldiers away from where their families were. So they would do this cat and mouse type, guerrilla type warfare with the soldiers, leading them from one hilltop to the other hilltop, staying out of range for the most part of their firearms, long enough for the families to escape and clear out of the area. In virtually every battle that we looked at, villagers were part of the equation, which what I mean by that is the Indians were trying to just allow enough engagement with the military to allow their families to escape. And so that was what was foremost in their mind was keep the military engaged, whether that's firing at them from 1,000 yards away or whatever the case may be, until their families could clear out of the area. And they were pretty successful at doing that. That is not to say, if they'd had the chance or the opportunity, that more damage could have been done. Even when the military attacked the Indian villages, like at Polydore Canyon, when Colonel McKenzie and the 4th Cavalry made their way down into Polydore Canyon and surprised the Indian villagers there that morning, there was no massacre. Eradication, if the other tactics didn't work. And the other tactics being to break their will and force them onto the reservations, which they did. At Polydore Canyon is a good example. They had the opportunity to eradicate them if that was their main objective. I don't believe that was their main objective at that point. In some cases, in some instances, that happened. Wounded Knee is a good example. Sand Creek is a good example. Washita River is a good example, but not every time. A lot of it depended, I think, on the military guy that was in command. McKenzie has, in some cases, been highly criticized for what people perceive how he treated some of the Indians. I personally don't believe it's justified. Polydore Canyon is a good example why. He had every opportunity to ride into that canyon and to have a massacre there, and that did not occur. He rode into that canyon, and they took the time and the opportunity to find the horse herd, to round up the horse herd, drive it out of the canyon and over to Toole Canyon, where the horses were ultimately killed. Then they gathered up all of the supplies that the Indians had, the teepees, their winter stores, put them in piles and burned them. And that made the Indians realize, we have no choice. We have no horses. We have no food. Winter's coming on. We have no choice except to move to the reservations. And that's what they did. And I think that's one of the primary examples during the Red River War why there were not that many deaths. And if that would not have worked, though, if they were not able to do that, the last alternative would have been, I think, eradication. They wouldn't have had any other choice. If the Indians would have been able to stop and put up the battles, but they were having to protect their families. And that's one of the reasons that Quanah Parker did not participate in any of the battles. He saw what was coming, and he took his band and headed south and took cover in the canyons down there and didn't engage with any of the troops until he surrendered in June of 1875.
A gentleman asks, have the actual locations of the Lyman wagon train fight or the Buffalo Wallow fight been located?
The locations of both the Lyman wagon train and Buffalo Wallow are well known. Those are both locations that we looked at and worked at. Unfortunately, at Buffalo Wallow, there was a marker that was established there in 1936. And I believe that the marker is probably in the location where the actual wallow was at. I don't know that for sure. Of course, Billy Dixon's wife was part of that event and was there whenever that was established and stuff. Unfortunately, we found very few artifacts at Buffalo Wallow. We began at the marker and then sort of worked our way out. I think we found 3 or 4 cartridges that were associated with Indian combatants some distance away from the marker. I remember when we were working there, we'd worked for several days having no luck at all, and happened one day to talk to a farmer who was farming right there adjacent. And he said, well, yeah, it's not surprising. People have been out here for years metal detecting and picking up artifacts and stuff. So I feel like most of those have probably been collected over the years and retrieved. Now, it's my understanding that just recently, there's been some more activity around there a little further away on a ridge top where some cartridges have been recovered. That appears to me probably is where the two groups met each other when they came over the ridge and sort of ran into each other at the same time. And then the scouts and the troopers retreated back to the Buffalo Wallow. I think that ridge top is probably where the initial sort of engagement began, north of the monument, which at the time we did not have access to that property.
A gentleman asks, are there any sites of skirmishes or battles during the project that you were not able to cover besides, say, more of Palo Duro or McClellan Creek, that you wish you had had even more time or resources?
So were there other sites that we wished we could have looked at but did not? Short answer is yes. To me, one of the interesting parts that we did not get to look at all was things like supply bases, supply camps for the military. We did not get to really look for and locate many of the Indian village sites that we know were in the immediate areas of some of these battles and stuff. So I think things like that, they're part of the story that we just did not have the time to do or the resources to do. So those are still things that someone younger than I can look for.
A gentleman asks, have you been to the Warren wagon train fight?
A Warren wagon train, I've not been to that location. I don't know enough about the properties set up and stuff, whether that's accessible or not.
I think it's kind of, where the monument of the historical marker, I think it's to the east on private property. And I was there earlier this summer, kind of drove around. It was, to find it was, get as close as I could, but it was on private property. So, I don't think you had to.
So one thing that I want to point out that reminded me, I often get questions about the artifacts that we recovered and where those artifacts are now. And I just wanted to let everyone know the agreements that we made, all of these battle sites that we looked at, those were on private property. And so the agreements that we made with the landowners at the time was, if you will allow us the opportunity to take the artifacts long enough to clean them, to analyze them, to conserve them if they need to be conserved, do all our analysis on them, photograph them, document them, then return those to the landowners. So all of those belong to the landowners. And once we completed our investigations, all that stuff went back to the individual landowners. Some of the landowners were overwhelmed with the number of stuff and didn't want all that stuff. So we worked with those individuals, if they wanted, to get those placed into a local museum of their choice. So we did not keep any of the items ourselves. Those all went back to the landowners, or they donated them to a museum.
A gentleman asks, where are the majority of the Indian War artifacts that y'all found? The majority of the artifacts that you guys found or located, where are they housed for public view?
So where are the artifacts that we found associated with the Indians? Where are they now for view? Again, so it just depends on the individual property owner, what he wanted done with them. There are a number at Panhandle Plains Historical Museum. The landowners there chose that facility for the artifacts that were on their property. The artifacts that we recovered from the Lyman wagon train, after we returned those to the landowner, those, to my understanding, he donated that collection to the River Valley Museum in Canadian. Pampa, are there artifacts from Pampa? Round Timber Creek artifacts. So the White Deer Land Museum in Pampa. All of the collection from the Battle of Red River, which was on two separate property owners, but it's my understanding that both of those property owners donated at least a portion of those artifacts to the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum in Canyon.
A madame asks, I had a question about, you said something about conserving the artifacts. Can you just briefly talk about how you conserve them?
How did we conserve the metal artifacts? So as you can imagine, because they were metal, most of them were highly corroded, been in the soil, in the dirt for 125 years. So there's a process. We took all of those artifacts to Texas A&M University, to their archaeological conservation lab that they have there. There's a process that they go through, electrolysis, where they're soaked in this acid with a battery charge that stops the corrosion process. And after they go through that, then they're treated with, essentially they're painted with a black paint that then keeps moisture out and conserves the metal. And so we had that done to the vast majority of the items that we recovered. Not all the cartridge cases, because some of those were too far corroded that once they go through that process, there wouldn't have been anything left. But for the bigger items, particularly like the knives and those kinds of things, anything that was of any size, we put through that process.
A gentleman asks, when you find the unfired cartridges, do you get to treat them like, say, if you find an unexploded bomb? Do you have to treat them specially? Or
do we treat the unfired cartridges in any special way? Most of the time, because of the powder that was in them, they had corroded so much. The powder had eaten its way already. If it gets wet at all with that metal, it'll start corroding and stuff. So most of those had little tiny pinhead-sized holes where all the powder had already leaked out and stuff. So for the most part, they were not dangerous at all.
I have his permission to paraphrase the final question. A gentleman asks, would you share with us your emotions as you were the first one to set foot on most of these battle sites? What was it like to unearth the Red River War?
If you'll tolerate me, I will tell you a little story concerning the Lyman Wagon Train battle site. It was the very first site that we attempted to get access to. When we met with the landowner there, at the time, that property was owned by an elderly gentleman named Bill Walker. I met him at his house, and I explained to him what we were wanting to do. I told him that we were trying to not only locate the battle site, which didn't need locating because he knew exactly where it was. It had been marked with a marker and stuff. But we were wanting to try and find out the extent, the full pattern of artifacts at that site and where the Indian locations were on the hills surrounding that battle site. Being with the state of Texas, it was not an easy sell. When I met with Glenn Bill and told him, and he responded to me and he said, I don't need the state of Texas or someone from the state of Texas telling me how to preserve this battle site. It has been preserved in our family for years, and we're doing just fine. And I said to him, Glenn Bill, you're absolutely right. Y'all have done a tremendous job at preserving the battle site. I said, but you and your family and a few local historians, you're the only ones that know anything about this battle site. I said, the school kids in Canadian, they don't have a clue that this battle site is here or what it means or the significance of this battle site in the history of Texas. And he looks at me and he said, you don't play fair, do you? And he said, but you're right. And I said, I don't want your artifacts. I just want to know the knowledge that those artifacts have and how we can go about getting them. And so he said, okay, you and your team, you can go out there and you can map those artifacts. You can use your metal detectors across the pasture there. You can map them, but I do not want you to excavate them. He said, I don't want you to dig them up. And I said, well, if that's the best that you can do, if that's what we can get, we'll take it. And so he said, okay, that's the agreement. So we went out and we started working our way across the battle site. And we started, every time we get a hit with a metal detector, we put a little pin flag there. He came out the first morning. We'd been working a couple of hours. He came out the first morning and he looks and he says, what are all these flags across the pasture? I said, well, those are items that we have hit with the metal detector and that we're marking so that after we get them all marked, we'll come back with our GPS receiver and we'll map the precise location of each thing. And then that'll produce a map that shows us the distribution of artifacts across the battle site. And he said, well, what are they? And I said, I don't know. It could be a cartridge case. It could be a bullet. It could be a tin can. It could be a piece of wire. It could be a nail. I said, we don't know, but at least we'll have a map. He stands there a minute and he pulls on his beard and he says, well, bring me the damn shovel. And from that point on, we couldn't keep up with him. But he became such an advocate for what we were doing and what we were trying to do that he even called other landowners on our behalf and got us access to some properties that we probably would not have gotten access to. The thrill of finding artifacts that you know were part of this campaign, it's a thrill. There's no doubt about it. But to me, when you're able to not just find that individual artifact, but begin to look at how that forms, hey, that's part of a skirmish line. Hey, that's where a rifle pit was, where the soldier dug to protect himself during the battle. Those are the kinds of thrills and information that when you do it, bring it all together, that's when it means something. It's not just the individual item. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
This program is brought to you by Wheeler County Historical Commission and the Frontier Regiment of the High Plains.